Sometimes you hear a phrase and it just clicks. It opens up a whole new perspective.
Mm.
I had that with this idea of language being a living vessel of holiness.
Ah, right. That's powerful imagery.
Isn't it? And it perfectly sets up what we're exploring today. Ge'ez.
A sacred language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church.
Exactly. And its connection, it's a really fundamental link to the Bible in Ethiopia.
And that living vessel idea, it captures how a language can hold so much, doesn't it? Not just words, but faith, history, identity, surviving for centuries.
It really does. And for you listening, this deep dive is, well, it's a chance to really get a feel for a Christian tradition that's incredibly ancient, but also very much alive today.
We're going beyond just, dusty linguistic facts here.
Definitely. We're looking at the keys to a unique spiritual world. And our information, it comes from the Tewahedo Heritage podcast, specifically their 3rd episode on gays in the Bible.
And also drawing a bit on the wider context of that series, which aims to, shed light on the core parts of this tradition: history, theology, practice.
Right. So our focus on Ge'ez today is really zeroing in on a crucial pillar of that identity.
Makes sense.
So what's the plan? First, we'll trace the history of Ge'ez itself. How did it start? How did it evolve?
Okay.
Then we'll look at the massive task of translating the Bible into Ge'ez.
A huge undertaking, no doubt.
Then we get into the really interesting part, the Ethiopian Biblical Canon, which is unique.
Including some books you probably haven't heard much about.
Like the Book of Enoch, which leads to our final point.
Mm.
It's amazing preservation story in Ethiopia. Ready to get into it?
Let's do it. And maybe the first thing to grasp is that Ge'ez. Well, it didn't start out as a purely religious language.
Good point. It was actually a spoken Semitic language way back in the Horn of Africa.
Part of that whole language family from the Middle East, yeah.
And this was before Christianity even arrived there. Think ancient kingdoms, like Aksum.
Right, and Ge'ez really grew in importance with the Aksumite Empire. It wasn't just everyday chat, it became the language of, government.
Of power, administration, culture, the whole deal. It shaped that entire kingdom.
Then things really shift in the 4th century. Big change.
That's when King Azana adopts Christianity as the state religion.
Exactly. And suddenly, Ge'ez gets this whole new layer of meaning. It becomes the language of faith.
Imagine that transition, sacred texts, prayers, rituals, all now happening in the language of the empire.
It's fascinating how a language goes from being, the main spoken tongue
to something primarily sacred and liturgical.
Yeah. How does that work?
Well, the sources suggest that around the 10th century, maybe a bit later, Ge'ez wasn't really the main spoken language anymore, but, and this is key, it was consciously kept.
Intentionally preserved.
Yes, as the liturgical and scriptural language for the church. You can kind of compare it to how Latin worked in the West for so long.
Or Church Slavonic in some Eastern Orthodox churches.
Right. Becomes a sacred link to history, to the spiritual roots.
That's a good parallel. It shows this isn't unique to Ethiopia, this idea of preserving a language specifically for religious reasons, even when daily life moves on. It gives the language itself a kind of inherent sanctity.
Precisely. And the source material emphasizes that through Ge'ez, the voices of key figures, prophets, apostles, martyrs, they're kept alive, specifically in their Ethiopian form.
A powerful sense of continuity there, cultural, spiritual.
Definitely. So, okay, we understand the language's journey. Now, the Bible translation, that's next, right?
Absolutely, because that's where Ge'ez really solidifies its sacred role.
And this wasn't a small job. It was huge. Scholars think the main translation effort happened between the 4th and 6th centuries.
So pretty soon after Christianity became the state religion.
Yeah, relatively quickly, which tells you something about priorities.
And think about the sources they were working from. Greek, Syriac, maybe even some Hebrew texts.
Translating all that biblical material back then, it speaks volumes about the commitment, the intellectual life of the early Ethiopian church.
It really does. It was a massive achievement.
And the result, the Ethiopian Bible, which is actually one of the oldest complete biblical traditions anywhere.
Older than the Latin Vulgate, much older than the King James Version most people know.
That really puts the Ethiopian church right at the heart of early Christian history, doesn't it? They weren't on the sidelines.
Not at all. They were active participants, engaging with the core texts very early on.
And we're not just talking about ideas on a page. The source mentions these incredible Ge'ez manuscripts.
Handwritten on parchment.
Yes, beautifully illustrated, preserved for centuries in monasteries. Places like Debre Damo, Abuna Gorima.
Gunda Gunda is another one mentioned.
Right, you can almost picture The monks, the scribes, carefully creating and protecting these texts.
That physical preservation is just extraordinary. These monasteries weren't just libraries, they were hubs of knowledge, keeping the tradition alive.
It shows incredible dedication from those communities over generations. Okay, so we've got the ancient language, the early translation. Now, let's talk about what's in that Ethiopian Bible, because it's different.
Very different in some ways. This is where we get into the canon, the official list of books.
And the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, they have the largest biblical canon in all of Christianity.
Yeah, the numbers vary slightly depending on how things are grouped, but generally 81 to 88 books.
Which is way more than the 66 in Protestant Bibles or the 73 in Catholic ones.
So what's included that's different? Well, beyond the standard Old and New Testaments, you have texts like the Book of Enoch,
which we'll come back to,
and the Book of Jubilees, the Ascension of Isaiah.
Also 1 and 2 Meqabyan. And the source is careful to point out these are not the same as the books of Maccabees found elsewhere.
Right, different historical accounts.
So why these extra books?
Well, it seems they reflect a connection to a wider range of early Jewish religious writing and thought.
Stuff that was influential back then.
Exactly. These texts were circulating, they were important, and while they eventually weren't included in the canons that formed in the West, Ethiopia held on to them. They revered them, translated them into Ge'ez.
So having them in the Ethiopian Bible gives us a unique window, doesn't it?
It really does. It's like a glimpse into forms of ancient Judaism that profoundly shaped Ethiopian Christianity.
Almost like finding missing pieces of the puzzle that got lost elsewhere. What does keeping a book like Enoch mean theologically for them, compared to traditions that dropped it?
That's a deep question. It certainly allows for a richer, maybe more complex understanding of the spiritual landscape back then. Early Christianity wasn't monolithic, you know.
Different regions value different texts. Makes sense.
Which leads us perfectly to the Book of Enoch. It's maybe the star example of this unique Ethiopian heritage.
Definitely the most famous example, I'd say.
Because for centuries, this book was basically lost to the West. Maybe some quotes, some fragments.
But the whole thing.
The complete text survived almost exclusively in Ge'ez, thanks entirely to those Ethiopian monks and scribes.
That's just, wow. When you realize that, it's quite an aha moment.
It really is. And the book itself is wild. Apocalyptic visions, angels, hierarchies of angels, prophecies.
A different kind of cosmology.
Yeah, a fascinating look into early religious imagination. And it wasn't some fringe text initially.
Oh, yeah.
Early church fathers like Tertullian actually quoted it. It had some standing.
Isn't there a New Testament link too?
Yes. The Epistle of Jude, verse 14, directly references Enoch or quotes from the book. So it was known, it was respected in some early Christian circles.
Which makes it even stranger that it disappeared from the Western canon.
Right. But in Ethiopia, it just kept going. A continuous, unbroken part of their sacred tradition. Imagine the challenges translating that kind of complex, visionary text back in the 4th or 5th century. How did that shape the Ge'ez Bible?
That continuity is the key point, isn't it? Ethiopian Christianity, by keeping texts like Enoch alive in Ge'ez, becomes this vital link.
A bridge, really. Connecting early Judaism, maybe some mystical strands of early Christianity to the present day.
Providing access to a spiritual heritage that took a different path elsewhere.
Precisely.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the main takeaway? The big picture.
I think it comes back to that initial idea language as more than just words.
The living vessel.
Exactly. It carries memory, identity, mystery, the sacred. Ge'ez does that perfectly for the Ethiopian Orthodox faith.
It's not just archaic scripture. The source calls it the lifeblood of their belief.
It connects today's believers directly to their history, the saints, the martyrs.
Through the words of the Bible, the sounds of the liturgy, all in Ge'ez.
It's that living connection across time. It really shows how vital linguistic heritage is for keeping a tradition vibrant.
Okay, so here's something to leave you with, something to chew on.
Go for it.
The fact that Ge'ez preserved these unique texts, like Enoch, almost single-handedly. Well, it makes you wonder, doesn't it?
About what else might be out there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It highlights the incredible diversity of early Christianity. And it poses the question, what other insights, what other knowledge about religious history might still be locked away in other ancient, less studied sacred languages around the world?
What other linguistic vessels are out there holding stories we haven't heard yet?
Makes you think, doesn't it? What might we be missing?